Ever worried about debt? That sinking feeling when bills pile up? Well, let me tell you, it could be a whole lot worse. Imagine living in a time when declaring bankruptcy didn't just mean losing your stuff. It could mean losing your freedom, your reputation, and maybe even a piece of yourself. Literally. Today, we're journeying back to the medieval world to uncover the brutal, fascinating, and often bizarre history of financial failure. Forget spreadsheets and lawyers. We're talking public humiliation, debtors' prisons, and a system where your very body could be held as collateral. This is the story of what happened when you couldn't pay your debts in the Middle Ages. So, what exactly happened if you, a medieval merchant or peasant, fell into debt? The first thing to understand is that there was no single, unified concept of bankruptcy like we have today. The laws were a patchwork quilt, varying wildly from city to city, kingdom to kingdom. But one common thread ran through almost all of them. Debt was a deeply personal and moral failing. It wasn't just a financial problem, it was a stain on your honor. In many places, especially in the bustling merchant cities of Italy where credit was king, the consequences were swift and theatrical. The word bankruptcy itself comes from the Italian bancarotta, which literally means broken bench. Why a broken bench? Because a moneylender or merchant conducted their business from a bench or table in the marketplace. If they went bust, their bench was ceremoniously broken in a public act of shame. Imagine the humiliation. Everyone in your town, your customers, your rivals, all watching as the symbol of your livelihood is smashed to pieces. This wasn't just about money. It was about destroying your public standing and your ability to ever do business again. But public shaming was often just the beginning. If breaking your bench wasn't enough to settle things, the next stop was often prison. And we're not talking about a modern correctional facility. Debtors' prisons were notoriously grim places. You weren't there to be rehabilitated. You were there to rot until you or your family could somehow scrape together the money to pay off your creditor. The conditions were horrific. Overcrowded, unsanitary, and often violent. Even worse, in many prisons, you had to pay for your own food and lodging. Think about that for a second. You're in prison because you have no money, and now you have to pay to survive inside. It was a vicious, inescapable cycle. Many people spent years, sometimes their entire lives, locked away for debts that seem trivial by today's standards. Families were torn apart, and a small financial stumble could easily become a life sentence. Now, let's get into some of the more visceral aspects of medieval debt collection. In some legal traditions, the concept of debt was tied directly to your physical body. An ancient Roman law, the Law of the 12 Tables, which influenced later European legal thought, had a particularly grim clause. It stated that if a debtor couldn't pay after a certain period, creditors could literally cut the debtor's body into pieces, with each creditor taking a share proportional to their loan. While historians debate whether this was ever practiced literally, the idea itself shows how seriously debt was taken. The threat alone was a powerful motivator. This concept of the body as collateral lingered. In some medieval societies, if you died with outstanding debts, your creditors could have a claim on your corpse. They could prevent its burial until the family paid up, a practice that was considered a profound religious and social dishonor. Imagine your loved one's soul unable to find peace because of a financial dispute. It was the ultimate form of leverage. So, was there any way out? Was there any hope for the medieval debtor? In some cases, yes. The concept of sanctuary offered a lifeline. A debtor could flee to a church or a designated sanctuary area. Once inside, they were generally safe from arrest by secular authorities. This gave them a breathing space, a chance to negotiate with their creditors from a position of relative safety. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it could buy precious time. Another avenue, particularly later in the Middle Ages, was for guilds or city councils to step in. They understood that a merchant's failure could have a ripple effect on the local economy. Sometimes they would mediate a settlement, allowing the debtor to pay back a reduced amount over a longer period. This was an early, informal version of the debt restructuring we see today. It was a pragmatic solution, born not necessarily from compassion, but from the realization that a functioning economy needed mechanisms to deal with failure without completely destroying the people within it. Religious attitudes also played a huge role in shaping the medieval experience of debt. On one hand, the Church strongly condemned usury, the charging of interest on loans. This made the very act of lending money a morally gray area. Theologians argued that time belonged to God, and therefore one couldn't charge money for the passage of time, which is essentially what interest is. This led to all sorts of creative financial arrangements to get around the rules. On the other hand, the Bible also emphasizes the importance of paying one's debts and being true to one's word. This created a paradox. Lenders were often viewed with suspicion, yet debtors were seen as morally flawed for failing to meet their obligations. This tension meant that while a creditor might be criticized for their greed, the debtor still bore the brunt of the social and legal consequences. It was a complex moral landscape where everyone could be judged and found wanting. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the early modern era, these attitudes began to shift. The rise of international trade and more complex economies made it clear that the old, brutal methods were not just cruel, but also bad for business. If every merchant who hit a rough patch was imprisoned or publicly disgraced, who would be left to take the risks necessary for economic growth? Legal systems began to evolve. In England, for example, the first bankruptcy laws emerged in the 16th century. Initially, they were still very punitive and aimed at punishing fraudulent debtors. But over time, a crucial distinction began to emerge: the difference between the unfortunate debtor, who failed due to bad luck or circumstances beyond their control, and the fraudulent debtor, who intentionally tried to cheat their creditors. This was a revolutionary idea. It opened the door for a system that could offer a fresh start, a way to clear the slate and become a productive member of society again. This was the seed from which our modern bankruptcy laws grew. So, what's the takeaway from this brutal history? It shows us how far we've come. Today, while bankruptcy is still a difficult and stressful process, it is fundamentally a civil and economic procedure. It recognizes that financial failure can happen to anyone and provides a structured path forward. We no longer break benches in the town square or lock people away indefinitely for a bad investment. Our system is built on the idea that second chances are not just compassionate, but economically necessary. The story of medieval debt is a stark reminder of a time when financial and moral ruin were one and the same, and when the price of failure was measured not just in money but in honor, freedom, and sometimes even flesh and blood. It makes you look at that credit card bill in a whole new light, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. It is incredible to see how these historical practices have shaped our modern world in ways we rarely think about. If you found this as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the surprising corners of history. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next video. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like to see me explore next. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.